I'm going to generalize a result, and it makes it a little easier if I write this in a different form. I want to rewrite this and say dividing by 4 is the same thing expected value. And although these words sound very formal and this definition might sound a little bit scary, it's really just what we just did, and it's no more difficult than that. Formally, here's the definition of expected value. If a random variable x can take on the n values x sub 1, x sub 2, x sub 3, all the way out to x sub n, and the probabilities that each of these values occur are p sub 1, p sub 2, p sub 3, all the way out to p sub n respectively. In other words, the p sub 1 is associated with the x sub 1, the p sub 2 is associated with the x sub 2, and so on. Then the expected value of the random variable, which we will abbreviate as capital E of x, is